Welcome to the War Archive, where wars become stories. In 1848, the United States didn't just win a war against Mexico, it broke the Mexican state. American troops occupied Mexico City. The Mexican army had collapsed. The government could no longer function. For the first time in its history, the United States stood inside a neighboring nation's capital with complete military control. There was no army left to stop it, no government strong enough to resist it. On paper, there was nothing preventing President James K. Polk from annexing the entire country. And many powerful people in Washington wanted him to do exactly that. They argued the war had already gone this far, so why stop now? Why leave Mexico standing at all? Yet Mexico was not erased. Its borders survived. Its name remained on the map. The reason is not found in a single battle or a single speech. It lies in what the war turned into, and in one decision that would later be made by a diplomat who was fired for making it. To understand why the United States did not annex all of Mexico, we have to follow the war beyond victory and watch where power stopped being useful. When the war began, this outcome was not the plan. The United States did not set out to occupy Mexico City or decide the fate of an entire nation. What American leaders believed they were starting was a limited war, aimed at forcing a settlement over land already in dispute. That dispute centered on Texas. When the United States annexed it, a border that had never been clearly settled suddenly mattered. Americans claimed the Rio Grande as the boundary. Mexico insisted the border lay farther north at the Nueces River. Between those two lines was land both sides believed was theirs, and neither side was prepared to step back without a fight. When troops from both countries entered the disputed zone, the clash that followed was small but decisive. American soldiers were killed. In Washington, that incident was framed as an attack on U.S. soil. President James K. Polk went to Congress arguing that Mexico had crossed a line and that war was now unavoidable. Polk did not ask Congress for a war of conquest. He asked for permission to defend American honor, secure the border, and force Mexico to negotiate. Congress agreed, in part because the conflict was expected to be short. Mexico was politically unstable, militarily weaker, and assumed to be incapable of sustaining a prolonged war. Public support rested on those assumptions. Americans were told the war would deliver clear gains at a manageable cost. It would resolve the Texas question, open the door to valuable Western land, and then end. There was no discussion of permanent occupation, no serious consideration of absorbing Mexico as a whole. At first, events seemed to confirm that expectation. American armies won key battles and advanced steadily. Mexican resistance was uneven and disorganized. Each victory reinforced the belief that the war was unfolding as planned, pressuring Mexico toward concessions it could no longer avoid. But success changed the character of the conflict. As American forces pushed farther south, the line between forcing negotiation and imposing control began to blur. What started as a war to compel agreement was becoming a war that made much larger outcomes possible. By the time U.S. troops approached Mexico City, the original purpose of the war no longer matched its reality. The United States was no longer simply enforcing a claim. It was exercising power on a scale that demanded new decisions. Ending the war now meant deciding not just how much land to take, but what kind of victory the country was actually prepared to accept. The fall of Mexico City changed the war's meaning overnight. Occupying a capital is not a bargaining tactic. It is a signal that the existing order has collapsed. What had been framed as pressure for a settlement now placed the United States in direct control of another nation's center of power, with no clear script for what came next. For President James K. Polk, this was not a victory he could simply declare complete. His political mandate was expansion, not absorption. California and the northern Mexican territories had always been the objective. They fit neatly into existing plans for settlement and statehood. Holding Mexico City did not. It raised questions he had never publicly answered and had no easy way to contain. The problem was not whether the United States could take more, it was what taking more would require. Occupation during war is temporary by design. Annexation is not. If the United States annexed all of Mexico, it would inherit responsibility for governing a country that did not consent to American rule and did not expect to be folded into the Union. That responsibility would not end when the treaty was signed. Momentum made the decision harder. Each military success made the next step seem more natural, even when it was not. Taking land felt familiar. Staying forever did not. The difference between the two was not just scale, it was permanence. Once crossed, that line could not be uncrossed. At the same time, Polk's political room to maneuver was shrinking. The war had critics from the beginning, and as it dragged on, their arguments gained traction. Casualties rose, costs mounted. Midterm elections weakened the administration's position in Congress. The coalition that had supported a short, decisive war did not necessarily support a permanent occupation. This mattered because peace required more than battlefield dominance. Any settlement had to survive Congress and public opinion. Annexing all of Mexico would force immediate debates over governance, representation, and national identity. Debates the administration had not promised and could not control. By the time peace became a realistic option, the choice facing the White House was no longer framed around opportunity. It was framed around risk. Ending the war with limits offered stability. Pushing further risked reopening a conflict whose justification was already wearing thin at home. The war had delivered leverage, but it had also exposed how narrow the margin for using that leverage had become. What looked like unlimited power from the battlefield translated into tightly constrained choices in Washington. The pressure on the administration did not ease as victory became certain. It intensified. Inside Washington, the debate shifted away from how to win the war and toward what winning now meant. The answer depended less on the Army's position than on the limits of American politics. President James K. Polk had been elected to expand the nation's borders, not to absorb a foreign society wholesale. California and the northern provinces fit his promise. They could be organized, settled, and admitted through familiar processes. Annexing all of Mexico would force decisions far beyond that framework, decisions Polk had never asked voters to authorize. Congress reflected this growing unease. Opposition to the war had existed from the start, but as costs rose and the timeline stretched, it became harder to ignore. Lawmakers who had tolerated a short conflict grew uneasy, with one that seemed to have no natural stopping point. Total annexation would not end debate. It would ignite a new one, larger and harder to contain. Timing worked against bold moves. Political capital fades, especially during a prolonged war. Midterm losses weakened the administration's leverage. Supporters who wanted expansion did not necessarily want permanent rule over millions of unwilling people. Critics who had opposed the war from the beginning now had evidence that it had exceeded its mandate. In this environment, annexing all of Mexico became less a culmination than a gamble. It would require Congress to endorse a dramatic change in the country's direction, while public patience was wearing thin. It would also demand answers to questions no one could clearly define in advance, about governance, representation, and the future balance of the Union. This was the moment when success began to work against itself. Victory removed Mexico's ability to resist, but it did not remove America's internal constraints. The easier it looked to take everything, the harder it became to justify doing so within the political order that made the war possible. Behind the scenes, another reality was taking shape. Ending the war would not be decided by speeches alone. It would depend on how peace was negotiated, by whom, and under what assumptions. The person tasked with that job would soon face a choice that no set of instructions could fully anticipate. At this point, the war stopped being just a question of presidential authority. It became a problem for the entire political system, and nothing exposed that more clearly than slavery. Every new piece of territory reopened the same unresolved conflict. Would it enter the Union as free or slave? The Mexican-American War did not raise that question once. It raised it repeatedly, across an area large enough to overwhelm every compromise that had kept the system functioning. Mexico had abolished slavery years earlier. That fact did not settle anything once annexation became possible. If the United States took Mexican land, Congress would decide its status. Southern politicians saw expansion as a way to protect slavery by spreading it. Northern lawmakers saw the same expansion as a direct threat to limiting it. The war turned territorial growth into a zero-sum struggle. Taking the northern provinces alone was enough to destabilize the balance. Taking all of Mexico would shatter it. Each potential state forced the same fight, and each decision shifted power permanently. There was no neutral outcome, no way to postpone the issue once annexation reached that scale. Scale mattered more than ideology. Smaller territorial additions allowed ambiguity and delay. Large ones forced clarity. Annexing all of Mexico would require immediate decisions across vast populated regions where slavery had no legal foundation and no local support. Enforcement would be difficult. Resistance would be inevitable. The political backlash would not stay contained. Even among slavery's defenders, this created anxiety. Turning much of Mexico into slave territory was not a simple legal act. It required sustained control over populations that had no stake in the institution. Failure would not just weaken slavery, it would expose its limits at the national level. For opponents of slavery, the danger ran in the opposite direction. Annexation risked tying the institution permanently to American expansion. What had been described as inherited or temporary could now be framed as essential to growth. The larger the annexation, the harder it became to imagine reversing course later. This was no longer just Polk's problem. Slavery transformed the question of annexation into a systemic risk. Taking all of Mexico would not delay the nation's internal conflict. It would force it forward, at a moment when the political system had very little capacity left to absorb the shock. Slavery exposed the political limits of expansion. Race and citizenship exposed its social ones. Taking all of Mexico would not just add territory to the United States, it would add millions of people all at once into a system that had never been designed to absorb them. Mexico was not a frontier waiting to be settled. It was a country with cities, courts, churches, and a population that spoke a different language and practiced a different religion. American expansion had usually followed a familiar pattern: land first, settlers next, institutions after. In Mexico, that sequence was reversed. The society was already there. This created a problem that could not be solved with maps or treaties. Taking land was easy. Ruling millions of angry people was hard. Annexation meant answering questions Congress had always avoided. Would Mexicans become citizens immediately? Would they be ruled as territories without representation? Or would they exist somewhere in between, governed without consent? Some politicians were unusually blunt about their concerns. Senator John C. Calhoun warned that the United States was, in his words, a government of the white race, and argued that absorbing millions of non-white Catholic Mexicans would fundamentally change it. He was not offering a moral argument. He was describing what he believed the political system could not survive. These views were not fringe. They translated directly into paralysis. Granting citizenship would give Mexicans political power. Denying it would turn the United States into a country ruling a large population without consent. Neither option fit comfortably within the nation's self-image as a republic. Scale made the dilemma worse. Previous territorial expansions involved relatively small populations that could be integrated over time. Annexing all of Mexico would overwhelm that process instantly. There would be no gradual transition, no long buffer period in which identity and loyalty could be negotiated. The question of belonging would arrive fully formed. Underlying these debates was a fear about legitimacy. Occupying Mexico during war could be justified as temporary. Annexing it meant staying there forever. That permanence blurred the line between expansion and empire, a line Americans had long insisted they were not crossing. By the time peace was seriously discussed, this issue could not be ignored. The war had made total annexation possible, but it had also made its consequences visible. Absorbing all of Mexico would not just change borders. It would force the United States to decide who counted as American and who did not, and many leaders were unwilling to take responsibility for that decision. While politicians argued over what annexation would mean in theory, the army was discovering what it meant in practice. Defeating Mexico's regular forces had been difficult but achievable. Controlling the country afterward was something else entirely. Victory removed organized resistance, but it did not produce acceptance. Across occupied territory, resistance changed form rather than disappearing. Guerrilla attacks became common. Supply convoys were ambushed. Small patrols were targeted. The goal was not to defeat the American army outright, but to make its presence costly and exhausting. Every mile held required more troops, more resources, and more time. Logistics magnified the problem. American forces were operating hundreds of miles from their bases, dependent on long supply lines that were easy to disrupt. Holding cities required permanent garrisons. Soldiers assigned to occupation duties could not be redeployed elsewhere. Each success created new obligations that did not end when battles did. This mattered because annexation would make these conditions permanent. Ending the war with limited gains allowed the United States to withdraw and concentrate control where settlement and administration seemed feasible. Annexing all of Mexico meant staying everywhere, north and south, cities and countryside, with no clear endpoint. Some supporters of total annexation argued that resistance would fade over time, as it had in earlier American expansions. But Mexico was not a sparsely populated frontier. It was a country with deep local ties, regional identities, and leadership structures capable of sustaining opposition long after formal defeat. Suppression on that scale would require years of continuous force. The financial cost was already becoming clear. The war had exceeded its expected budget, and maintaining a large occupying army indefinitely would require higher taxes or long-term debt. What had been promoted as a conflict that would pay for itself was becoming an ongoing expense with no obvious return. For commanders on the ground, the lesson was blunt. Taking territory was one thing, governing it was another. Military victory could open the door to annexation, but it could not close the door on resistance. By the time peace negotiations gained momentum, it was increasingly clear that annexing all of Mexico would not end the war. It would change its shape and extend it indefinitely. Despite all of these constraints, the idea of annexing all of Mexico never disappeared. In fact, for a vocal group of Americans, the war's scale made stopping feel illogical. If the United States had already paid the cost, blood, money, and political division, why accept anything less than the maximum return? Supporters of total annexation argued first from power. Mexico's central government had collapsed. Its capital was occupied. From their perspective, resistance had already been broken, and whatever remained could be handled with time and persistence. The United States had faced opposition before during westward expansion, and it had always prevailed. Mexico, they believed, would not be an exception. Economic arguments followed. The northern territories the United States most wanted were vast but underdeveloped. Central and southern Mexico, by contrast, were productive, populated, and already integrated into trade networks. Annexing those regions promised immediate agriculture, tax revenue, and access to ports. Some argued that taking all of Mexico would not only justify the war, it would make it profitable. Strategic logic reinforced this view. Full control of Mexico's coastline would give the United States unmatched access to both the Pacific and the Caribbean. Partial annexation left borders exposed and influence incomplete. From this perspective, stopping short created future vulnerabilities rather than solving existing ones. Beneath these arguments was a deeper assumption that American governance would ultimately stabilize what Mexican governments had struggled to control. Supporters believed that once annexed, resistance would fade, institutions would take root, and order would follow. Time, they argued, would smooth over what force had begun. What united these positions was confidence. Advocates of total annexation believed the hardest part was already over. Everything that followed would be difficult, but manageable. The real mistake, in their view, would be failing to finish what the war had started. Yet this confidence revealed a growing divide. Expansionists were focused on what might be gained in the future. Their opponents were focused on what was already being strained in the present. The disagreement was not over whether annexation was possible, but over whether the United States could afford to discover its limits only after crossing them. As peace negotiations continued, these competing visions remained unresolved. The war had created the opportunity for total annexation, but it had also exposed how much that opportunity would cost. The final outcome would depend less on what expansion promised in theory, and more on how the war could realistically be brought to an end. The responsibility for ending the war did not fall to a general or a senator. It fell to a diplomat. Nicholas Trist had been sent to Mexico to do something narrow and practical, negotiate a treaty that would formalize American gains and bring the fighting to a close. On paper, Trist's instructions were clear. He was to secure the territories the war had been fought to obtain and return with an agreement Washington could ratify. He was not empowered to reshape the continent, and he was not expected to decide how far American expansion should go. That question was supposed to be settled back home. But the situation Trist encountered did not match the assumptions behind those orders. He saw how much effort it took to hold cities that did not want American rule. He saw how resentment deepened the longer occupation continued. For him, the problem was no longer how much leverage the United States had, but how quickly that leverage was decaying. As negotiations dragged on, frustration grew in Washington. President James K. Polk began to believe that Trist was moving too cautiously and missing an opportunity to demand more. Eventually, Polk recalled him, formally ending his authority to negotiate. Under normal circumstances, that would have ended the process immediately. Trist did not leave. He believed that delay was dangerous. Every month without a settlement meant more fighting, more cost, and more political strain on both countries. Pushing for total annexation would not simply extend negotiations, it would prolong the war itself. Trist concluded that a limited peace was not a compromise of victory, but the only way to end the conflict at all. Acting without authorization, he continued talks with Mexican officials. The treaty he worked toward drew a clear line. It secured California and the Southwest, fulfilling the war's original objectives, while stopping short of absorbing Mexico as a whole. Compensation was included to frame the agreement as a negotiated settlement rather than outright seizure. This was not a dramatic gesture of defiance. It was a calculation. Trist understood that ignoring the recall would likely end his career. He also understood that presenting Washington with a finished treaty would force a choice that delay had avoided. Accepting the agreement would end the war. Rejecting it would mean choosing escalation openly. When Trist sent the treaty home, he removed ambiguity from the situation. The option of waiting for a better moment was gone. What remained was a decision between concluding the war as it now existed or continuing it in pursuit of an outcome that had already proven costly and divisive. When the treaty reached Washington, it arrived at a moment when the country's patience for the war was largely exhausted. What had begun as a confident push for expansion now felt like a prolonged conflict searching for an ending. Lawmakers were no longer debating how to win. They were debating how to stop. President James K. Polk was openly dissatisfied with what Trist had sent. The agreement fell short of what complete military dominance seemed to allow, and it had been negotiated by a man who no longer had the authority to act. But Polk also understood the position he was in. Rejecting the treaty would not rewind the war to its early optimism. It would restart it under far worse political conditions. Congress faced the same reality. Many members believed the United States could take more land if it chose to. Far fewer believed it could do so without triggering a new set of crises. Accepting the treaty secured the war's central objectives, California and the Southwest, without committing the nation to permanent occupation, unresolved constitutional battles, and an open-ended military presence deep inside Mexico. The alternative was not simply more victory. It was renewed fighting, deeper resistance, and a conflict that would need to be justified all over again, this time without the clarity of the original border dispute. Annexing all of Mexico would force Congress to confront slavery, citizenship, and empire simultaneously, with no workable compromise in sight. Public opinion reflected this shift. Expansionist voices remained loud, but enthusiasm for prolonging the war had faded. The United States had already gained vast territory. For many Americans, that felt sufficient. Ending the war now promised stability. Continuing it promised more arguments, more cost, and no clear endpoint. Approving the treaty did not mean the decision was celebrated. It meant it was tolerated. Enough lawmakers were unwilling to push further. The vote represented acceptance of limits rather than fulfillment of ambition. The war would end not because the United States had taken everything it could, but because continuing to take more no longer made political sense. When the treaty was ratified, the fighting stopped. American troops prepared to withdraw from Mexico City. The war concluded not with a final act of conquest, but with a deliberate decision to close a chapter that had already stretched far beyond its original purpose. By the time the war ended, the question of annexing all of Mexico was no longer about what the United States could do. That had already been demonstrated. The question was whether the country could turn overwhelming victory into permanent control without creating problems it could not manage or contain. The war revealed limits that were not obvious at the start. Expansion had always assumed that new land could be absorbed gradually, settled, governed, and made American over time. Mexico broke that assumption. It was not a blank space or a distant frontier. It was a society that resisted being reduced to territory on a map. Each constraint reinforced the next. Slavery turned expansion into a political crisis. Citizenship turned conquest into a legitimacy problem. Occupation turned victory into an ongoing cost. None of these issues could be solved on their own, and annexing all of Mexico would have combined them into a single permanent condition. Stopping short was not an act of hesitation or moral awakening, it was a calculation about sustainability. The lands that were taken could be governed within existing political structures. The lands that were left behind could not be absorbed without forcing the United States to confront contradictions it was not prepared to resolve. There was an irony in how the war ended. It had been fought in the name of strength and expansion, yet taking everything would have weakened the country by accelerating internal conflict and committing it to endless control. The limits of American power became visible only once that power seemed absolute. Mexico remained on the map not because it defeated the United States, but because conquest reached a point where it stopped being useful. Victory made total annexation possible. Reality made it untenable.